The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, Part 6 out of 8. Himself for the inadequacy of the dinner by the perfection of his cigar, Mr. Jackson became portentous and communicable. If the Beaufort smash comes, he announced, there are going to be disclosures. Archer raised his head quickly. He could never hear the name without the sharp vision of Beaufort's heavy figure, opulently furred and shod, advancing through the snow at Skuytercliff. There's bound to be, Mr. Jackson continued, the nastiest kind of a cleaning up. He hasn't spent all his money on Regina. Oh, well, that's discounted, isn't it? My belief is he will pull out yet, said the young man, wanting to change the subject. Perhaps. I know he was to see some of the influential people today. Of course, Mr. Jackson reluctantly conceded, it's to be hoped they can tide him over this time anyhow. I shouldn't like to think of poor Regina's spending the rest of her life in some shabby foreign watering place for bankrupts. Archer said nothing. It seemed to him so natural, however tragic, that money ill-gotten should be cruelly expiated, that his mind, hardly lingering over Mrs. Beaufort's doom, wandered back to closer questions. What was the meaning of May's blush when the Countess Olenska had been mentioned? 4 months had passed since the midsummer day that he and Madame Olenska had spent together, and since then he had not seen her. He knew that she had returned to Washington, to the little house which she and Medora Manson had taken there. He had written to her once a few words, asking when they were to meet again, and she had even more briefly replied, "Not yet." Since then, there had been no farther communication between them, and he had built up within himself a kind of sanctuary in which she throned among his secret thoughts and longings. Little by little it became the scene of his real life, of his only rational activities. Thither he brought the books he read, the ideas and feelings which nourished him, his judgments and his visions. Outside it, in the scene of his actual life, he moved with a growing sense of unreality and insufficiency, blundering against familiar prejudices and traditional points of view as an absent-minded man goes on bumping into the furniture of his own room. Absent, that was what he was, so absent from everything most densely real and near to those about him that it sometimes startled him to find they still imagined he was there. He became aware that Mr. Jackson was clearing his throat preparatory to farther revelations. "I don't know, of course, how far your wife's family are aware of what people say about Madame Olenska's refusal to accept her husband's latest offer." Archer was silent, and Mr. Jackson obliquely continued, "It's a pity, it's certainly a pity that she refused it." A pity, in God's name, why? Mr. Jackson looked down his leg to the unwrinkled sock that joined it to a glossy pump. "Well, to put it on the lowest ground, what's she going to live on now?" Now, if Beaufort— Archer sprang up, his fist banging down on the black walnut edge of the writing table. The wells of the brass double inkstand danced in their sockets. "What the devil do you mean, sir?" Mr. Jackson, shifting himself slightly in his chair, turned a tranquil gaze on the young man's burning face. Well, I have it on pretty good authority, in fact, on old Catherine's herself, that the family reduced Countess Olenska's allowance considerably when she definitely refused to go back to her husband. And as, by this refusal, she also forfeits the money settled on her when she married, which Olenska was ready to make over to her if she returned. Why? What the devil do you mean, my dear boy? Archer moved toward the mantelpiece and bent over to knock his ashes into the grate. I don't know anything of Madame Olenska's private affairs, but I don't need to be certain that what you insinuate— Oh, I don't, it's Lefferts, for one, Mr. Jackson interposed. Lefferts, who made love to her and got snubbed for it, Archer broke out contemptuously. Ah, did he? Snapped the other, as if this were exactly the fact he had been laying a trap for. He still sat sideways from the fire, so that his hard old gaze held Archer's face as if in a spring of steel. Well, well, it's a pity she didn't go back before Beaufort's cropper, he repeated. If she goes now, and if he fails, it will only confirm the general impression, which isn't by any means peculiar to Lefferts. By the way, oh, she won't go back now, less than ever. Archer had no sooner said it than he had once more the feeling that it was exactly what Mr. Jackson had been waiting for. The old gentleman considered him attentively. That's your opinion, eh? Well, no doubt you know. But everybody will tell you that the few pennies Medora Manson has left are all in Beaufort's hands. And how the two women are to keep their heads above water unless he does, I can't imagine. Of course, Madame Olenska may still soften old Catherine, who's been the most inexorably opposed to her staying. And old Catherine could make her any allowance she chooses. But we all know that she hates parting with good money, and the rest of the family have no particular interest in keeping Madame Olenska here. Archer was burning with unavailing wrath. He was exactly in the state when a man is sure to do something stupid, knowing all the while that he is doing it. He saw that Mr. Jackson had been instantly struck by the fact that Madame Olenska's differences with her grandmother and her other relations were not known to him, and that the old gentleman had drawn his own conclusions as to the reasons for Archer's exclusion from the family councils. This fact warned Archer to go warily, but the insinuations about Beaufort made him reckless. He was mindful, however, if not of his own danger, at least of the fact that Mr. Jackson was under his mother's roof, and consequently his guest. Old New York scrupulously observed the etiquette of hospitality, and no discussion with a guest was ever allowed to degenerate into a disagreement. "Shall we go up and join my mother?" he suggested curtly, as Mr. Jackson's last cone of ashes dropped into the brass ashtray at his elbow. On the drive homeward May remained oddly silent. Through the darkness, he still felt her enveloped in her menacing blush. What its menace meant he could not guess, but he was sufficiently warned by the fact that Madame Olenska's name had evoked it. They went upstairs, and he turned into the library. She usually followed him, but he heard her passing down the passage to her bedroom. "May," he called out impatiently, and she came back with a slight glance of surprise at his tone. "This lamp is smoking again. I should think the servants might see that it's kept properly trimmed," he grumbled nervously. "I am so sorry. It shan't happen again," she answered, in the firm, bright tone she had learned from her mother. And it exasperated Archer to feel that she was already beginning to humor him like a younger Mr. Welland. She bent over to lower the wick, and as the light struck up on her white shoulders and the clear curves of her face, he thought, "How young she is! For what endless years this life will have to go on." He felt, with a kind of horror, his own strong youth, and the bounding blood in his veins. "Look here," he said suddenly, "I may have to go to Washington for a few days soon, next week perhaps." Her hand remained on the key of the lamp as she turned to him slowly. The heat from its flame had brought back a glow to her face, but it paled as she looked up. "On business?" she asked, in a tone which implied that there could be no other conceivable reason, and that she had put the question automatically, as if merely to finish his own sentence. "On business, naturally. There's a patent case coming up before the Supreme Court." He gave the name of the inventor, and went on furnishing details with all Lawrence Lefferts's practiced glibness, while she listened attentively, saying at intervals, "Yes, I see. The change will do you good," she said simply, when he had finished, "and you must be sure to go and see Ellen." She added, looking him straight in the eyes with her cloudless smile, and speaking in the tone she might have employed in urging him not to neglect some irksome family duty. It was the only word that passed between them on the subject, but in the code in which they had both been trained it meant, "Of course you understand that I know all that people have been saying about Ellen, and heartily sympathize with my family in their effort to get her to return to her husband. I also know that, for some reason you have not chosen to tell me, you have advised her against this course, which all the older men of the family, as well as our grandmother, agree in approving, and that it is owing to your encouragement that Ellen defies us all, and exposes herself to the kind of criticism of which Mr. Sillerton Jackson probably gave you this evening the hint that has made you so irritable." "Hints have indeed not been wanting, but since you appear unwilling to take them from others, I offer you this one myself, in the only form in which well-bred people of our kind can communicate unpleasant things to each other, by letting you understand that I know you mean to see Ellen when you are in Washington, and are perhaps going there expressly for that purpose, and that, since you are sure to see her, I wish you to do so with my full and explicit approval, and to take the opportunity of letting her know what the course of conduct you have encouraged her in is likely to lead to." Her hand was still on the key of the lamp when the last word of this mute message reached him. She turned the wick down, lifted off the globe, and breathed on the sulky flame. "They smell less if one blows them out," she explained, with her bright housekeeping air. On the threshold she turned and paused for his kiss. Roman 27, Wall Street, the next day, had more reassuring reports of Beaufort's situation. They were not definite, but they were hopeful. It was generally understood that he could call on powerful influences in case of emergency, and that he had done so with success, and that evening, when Mrs. Beaufort appeared at the opera wearing her old smile and a new emerald necklace. Society drew a breath of relief. New York was inexorable in its condemnation of business irregularities. So far there had been no exception to its tacit rule that those who broke the law of probity must pay. And every one was aware that even Beaufort and Beaufort's wife would be offered up unflinchingly to this principle. But to be obliged to offer them up would be not only painful but inconvenient. The disappearance of the Beauforts would leave a considerable void in their compact little circle, and those who were too ignorant or too careless to shudder at the moral catastrophe bewailed in advance the loss of the best ball-room in New York. Archer had definitely made up his mind to go to Washington. He was waiting only for the opening of the lawsuit of which he had spoken to May, so that its date might coincide with that of his visit. But on the following Tuesday, he learned from Mr. Letterblair that the case might be postponed for several weeks. Nevertheless, he went home that afternoon determined in any event to leave the next evening. The chances were that May, who knew nothing of his professional life, and had never shown any interest in it, would not learn of the postponement, should it take place, nor remember the names of the litigants if they were mentioned before her. And at any rate he could no longer put off seeing Madame Olenska. There were too many things that he must say to her on the Wednesday morning, when he reached his office. Mr. Letterblair met him with a troubled face. Beaufort, after all, had not managed to tide over. But by setting afloat the rumor that he had done so he had reassured his depositors, and heavy payments had poured into the bank till the previous evening, when disturbing reports again began to predominate. In consequence, a run on the bank had begun, and its doors were likely to close before the day was over. The ugliest things were being said of Beaufort's dastardly maneuver, and his failure promised to be one of the most discreditable in the history of Wall Street. The extent of the calamity left Mr. Letterblair white and incapacitated. "I've seen bad things in my time, but nothing as bad as this. Everybody we know will be hit, one way or another. And what will be done about Mrs. Beaufort? What can be done about her? I pity Mrs. Manson Mingot as much as anybody, coming at her age. There's no knowing what effect this affair may have on her. She always believed in Beaufort, she made a friend of him, and there's the whole Dallas connection. Poor Mrs. Beaufort is related to every one of you. Her only chance would be to leave her husband, yet how can anyone tell her so? Her duty is at his side. And luckily she seems always to have been blind to his private weaknesses." There was a knock, and Mr. Letterblair turned his head sharply. "What is it?" "I can't be disturbed." A clerk brought in a letter for Archer and withdrew. Recognizing his wife's hand, the young man opened the envelope and read, "Want you please come uptown as early as you can. Granny had a slight stroke last night." In some mysterious way she found out, before anyone else, this awful news about the bank. Uncle Lovell is away shooting, and the idea of the disgrace has made poor papa so nervous that he has a temperature and can't leave his room. Mamma needs you dreadfully, and I do hope you can get away at once and go straight to Granny's. Archer handed the note to his senior partner, and a few minutes later was crawling northward in a crowded horse car, which he exchanged at 14th Street for one of the high staggering omnibuses of the Fifth Avenue line. It was after 12 o'clock when this laborious vehicle dropped him at Old Catherine's. The sitting-room window on the ground floor, where she usually throned, was tenanted by the inadequate figure of her daughter, Mrs. Welland, who signed a haggard welcome as she caught sight of Archer, and at the door he was met by May. The hall wore the unnatural appearance peculiar to well-kept houses suddenly invaded by illness. Wraps and furs lay in heaps on the chairs. A doctor's bag and overcoat were on the table, and beside them letters and cards had already piled up unheeded. May looked pale but smiling. Dr. Bencomb, who had just come for the second time, took a more hopeful view. And Mrs. Mingot's dauntless determination to live and get well was already having an effect on her family. May led Archer into the old lady's sitting room, where the sliding doors opening into the bedroom had been drawn shut, and the heavy yellow damask portieres dropped over them, and here Mrs. Welland communicated to him in horrified undertones the details of the catastrophe. It appeared that the evening before something dreadful and mysterious had happened. At about 8 o'clock, just after Mrs. Mingot had finished the game of solitaire that she always played after dinner, the door-bell had rung, and a lady so thickly veiled that the servants did not immediately recognize her had asked to be received. The butler, hearing a familiar voice, had thrown open the sitting-room door, announcing Mrs. Julius Beaufort, and had then closed it again on the two ladies. They must have been together, he thought, about an hour. When Mrs. Mingot's bell rang, Mrs. Beaufort had already slipped away unseen, and the old lady, white and vast and terrible, sat alone in her great chair, and signed to the butler to help her into her room. She seemed, at that time, though obviously distressed, in complete control of her body and brain. The mulatto maid put her to bed, brought her a cup of tea as usual, laid everything straight in the room, and went away. But at 3 in the morning the bell rang again, and the two servants, hastening in at this unwonted summons, for old Catherine usually slept like a baby, had found their mistress sitting up against her pillows with a crooked smile on her face and one little hand hanging limp from its huge arm. The stroke had clearly been a slight one, for she was able to articulate and to make her wishes known. And soon after the doctor's first visit she had begun to regain control of her facial muscles. But the alarm had been great, and proportionately great was the indignation when it was gathered from Mrs. Mingot's fragmentary phrases that Regina Beaufort had come to ask her incredible effrontery to back up her husband, see them through, not to desert them, as she called it, in fact to induce the whole family to cover and condone their monstrous dishonor. I said to her, honor's always been honor, and honesty honesty, in Manson Mingot's house, and will be till I am carried out of it feet first. The old woman had stammered into her daughter's ear, in the thick voice of the partly paralyzed. And when she said, "But my name, Auntie, my name's Regina Dallas," I said, "It was Beaufort when he covered you with jewels. And it's got to stay Beaufort now that he's covered you with shame." So much, with tears and gasps of horror, Mrs. Welland imparted, blanched and demolished by the unwanted obligation of having at last to fix her eyes on the unpleasant and the discreditable. "If only I could keep it from your father-in-law. He always says, 'Augusta, for pity's sake, don't destroy my last illusions,' and how am I to prevent his knowing these horrors?" the poor lady wailed. "After all, mamma, he won't have seen them," her daughter suggested, and Mrs. Welland sighed. "Ah, no. Thank heaven he's safe in bed, and Dr. Bencomb has promised to keep him there till poor mamma is better. And Regina has been got away somewhere." Archer had seated himself near the window, and was gazing out blankly at the deserted thoroughfare. It was evident that he had been summoned rather for the moral support of the stricken ladies than because of any specific aid that he could render. Mr. Lovell Mingott had been telegraphed for, and messages were being dispatched by hand to the members of the family living in New York. And meanwhile, there was nothing to do but to discuss in hushed tones the consequences of Beaufort's dishonor and of his wife's unjustifiable action. Mrs. Lovell Mingott, who had been in another room writing notes, presently reappeared, and added her voice to the discussion. In their day, the elder ladies agreed, the wife of a man who had done anything disgraceful in business had only one idea: to efface herself, to disappear with him. There was the case of poor Grandmamma Spicer, your great-grandmother, May, of course. Mrs. Welland hastened to add, "Your great-grandfather's money difficulties were private losses at cards, or signing a note for somebody I never quite knew, because mamma would never speak of it. But she was brought up in the country, because her mother had to leave New York after the disgrace. Whatever it was, they lived up the Hudson alone, winter and summer, till mamma was 16. It would never have occurred to Grandmamma Spicer to ask the family to countenance her, as I understand Regina calls it. Though a private disgrace is nothing compared to the scandal of ruining hundreds of innocent people. Yes, it would be more becoming in Regina to hide her own countenance than to talk about other people's." Mrs. Lovell Mingott agreed. "I understand that the emerald necklace she wore at the opera last Friday had been sent on approval from Ball and Black's in the afternoon. I wonder if they will ever get it back." Archer listened unmoved to the relentless chorus. The idea of absolute financial probity as the first law of a gentleman's code was too deeply ingrained in him for sentimental considerations to weaken it. An adventurer like Lemuel Struthers might build up the millions of his shoe polish on any number of shady dealings. But unblemished honesty was the noblesse oblige of old financial New York. Nor did Mrs. Beaufort's fate greatly move Archer. He felt, no doubt, more sorry for her than her indignant relatives. But it seemed to him that the tie between husband and wife, even if breakable in prosperity, should be indissoluble in misfortune. As Mr. Letterblair had said, a wife's place was at her husband's side when he was in trouble. But society's place was not at his side, and Mrs. Beaufort's cool assumption that it was seemed almost to make her his accomplice. The mere idea of a woman's appealing to her family to screen her husband's business dishonor was inadmissible, since it was the one thing that the family as an institution could not do. The mulatto maid called Mrs. Lovell Mingott into the hall, and the latter came back in a moment with a frowning brow. "She wants me to telegraph for Ellen Olenska. I had written to Ellen, of course, and to Medora. But now it seems that's not enough. I am to telegraph to her immediately, and to tell her that she's to come alone." The announcement was received in silence. Mrs. Welland sighed resignedly, and May rose from her seat and went to gather up some newspapers that had been scattered on the floor. "I suppose it must be done," Mrs. Lovell Mingott continued, as if hoping to be contradicted. And May turned back toward the middle of the room. "Of course it must be done," she said. "Granny knows what she wants, and we must carry out all her wishes." "Shall I write the telegram for you, Auntie? If it goes at once, Ellen can probably catch tomorrow morning's train." She pronounced the syllables of the name with a peculiar clearness, as if she had tapped on two silver bells. "Well, it can't go at once. Jasper and the pantry boy are both out with notes and telegrams." May turned to her husband with a smile. "But here's Newland, ready to do anything." "Will you take the telegram, Newland? There will be just time before luncheon." Archer rose with a murmur of readiness, and she seated herself at old Catherine's rosewood boudoir du jour, and wrote out the message in her large immature hand. When it was written, she blotted it neatly and handed it to Archer. "What a pity," she said, "that you and Ellen will cross each other on the way. Newland," she added, turning to her mother and aunt, "is obliged to go to Washington about a patent law suit that is coming up before the Supreme Court. I suppose Uncle Lovell will be back by tomorrow night, and with Granny improving so much it doesn't seem right to ask Newland to give up an important engagement for the firm, does it?" She paused, as if for an answer, and Mrs. Welland hastily declared, "Oh, of course not, darling. Your Granny would be the last person to wish it." As Archer left the room with the telegram, he heard his mother-in-law add, "Presumably to Mrs. Lovell Mingott, but why on earth she should make you telegraph for Ellen Olenska?" And May's clear voice rejoined, "Perhaps it's to urge on her again that after all her duty is with her husband." The outer door closed on Archer, and he walked hastily away toward the telegraph office. Roman 28. How'd you spell it, anyhow?" asked the tart young lady to whom Archer had pushed his wife's telegram across the brass ledge of the Western Union office. Olenska," he repeated, drawing back the message in order to print out the foreign syllables above May's rambling script. "It's an unlikely name for a New York telegraph office, at least in this quarter," an unexpected voice observed. And turning around, Archer saw Lawrence Lefferts at his elbow, pulling an imperturbable mustache and affecting not to glance at the message. "Hello, Newland. Thought I should catch you here. I've just heard of old Mrs. Mingott's stroke, and as I was on my way to the house I saw you turning down this street and nipped after you. I suppose you've come from there." Archer nodded, and pushed his telegram under the lattice. "Very bad, eh?" Lefferts continued. "Wiring to the family, I suppose?" "I gather it is bad, if you are including Countess Olenska." Archer's lips stiffened. He felt a savage impulse to dash his fist into the long, vain, handsome face at his side. "Why?" he questioned. Lefferts, who was known to shrink from discussion, raised his eyebrows with an ironic grimace that warned the other of the watching damsel behind the lattice. Nothing could be worse form, the look reminded Archer, than any display of temper in a public place. Archer had never been more indifferent to the requirements of form, but his impulse to do Lawrence Lefferts a physical injury was only momentary. The idea of bandying Ellen Olenska's name with him at such a time, and on whatsoever provocation, was unthinkable. He paid for his telegram, and the two young men went out together into the street. There Archer, having regained his self-control, went on. "Mrs. Mingott is much better. The doctor feels no anxiety whatever." And Lefferts, with profuse expressions of relief, asked him if he had heard that there were beastly bad rumors again about Beaufort. That afternoon the announcement of the Beaufort failure was in all the papers. It overshadowed the report of Mrs. Manson Mingott's stroke, and only the few who had heard of the mysterious connection between the two events thought of ascribing old Catherine's illness to anything but the accumulation of flesh and years. The whole of New York was darkened by the tale of Beaufort's dishonor. There had never, as Mr. Letterblair said, been a worse case in his memory, nor, for that matter, in the memory of the far-off Letterblair who had given his name to the firm. The bank had continued to take in money for a whole day after its failure was inevitable, and as many of its clients belonged to one or another of the ruling clans, Beaufort's duplicity seemed doubly cynical. If Mrs. Beaufort had not taken the tone that such misfortunes, the word was her own, were the test of friendship, compassion for her might have tempered the general indignation against her husband. As it was, and especially after the object of her nocturnal visit to Mrs. Manson Mingott had become known, her cynicism was held to exceed his, and she had not the excuse, nor her detractors the satisfaction, of pleading that she was a foreigner. It was some comfort to those whose securities were not in jeopardy to be able to remind themselves that Beaufort was. But, after all, if a Dallas of South Carolina took his view of the case, and glibly talked of his soon being on his feet again, the argument lost its edge, and there was nothing to do but to accept this awful evidence of the indissolubility of marriage. Society must manage to get on without the Beauforts, and there was an end of it, except indeed for such hapless victims of the disaster as Medora Manson. The poor old Miss Lannings, and certain other misguided ladies of good family who, if only they had listened to Mr. Henry van der Luyden. "The best thing the Beauforts can do," said Mrs. Archer, summing it up as if she were pronouncing a diagnosis and prescribing a course of treatment, "is to go and live at Regina's little place in North Carolina. Beaufort has always kept a racing stable, and he had better breed trotting horses. I should say he had all the qualities of a successful horse-dealer." Every one agreed with her, but no one condescended to inquire what the Beauforts really meant to do. The next day Mrs. Manson Mingott was much better. She recovered her voice sufficiently to give orders that no one should mention the Beauforts to her again, and asked when Dr. Bencomb appeared what in the world her family meant by making such a fuss about her health. If people of my age will eat chicken salad in the evening, what are they to expect? She inquired. And, the doctor having opportunely modified her dietary, the stroke was transformed into an attack of indigestion. But, in spite of her firm tone, old Catherine did not wholly recover her former attitude toward life. The growing remoteness of old age, though it had not diminished her curiosity about her neighbors, had blunted her never very lively compassion for their troubles, and she seemed to have no difficulty in putting the Beaufort disaster out of her mind. But, for the first time, she became absorbed in her own symptoms, and began to take a sentimental interest in certain members of her family to whom she had hitherto been contemptuously indifferent. Mr. Welland, in particular, had the privilege of attracting her notice. Of her sons-in-law he was the one she had most consistently ignored, and all his wife's efforts to represent him as a man of forceful character and marked intellectual ability, if he had only chosen, had been met with a derisive chuckle. But his eminence as a valetudinarian now made him an object of engrossing interest, and Mrs. Mingot issued an imperial summons to him to come and compare diets as soon as his temperature permitted. For old Catherine was now the first to recognize that one could not be too careful about temperatures. 24 hours after Madame Olenska's summons, a telegram announced that she would arrive from Washington on the evening of the following day. At the Wellands, where the Newland Archers chanced to be lunching, the question as to who should meet her at Jersey City was immediately raised, and the material difficulties amid which the Welland household struggled as if it had been a frontier outpost lent animation to the debate. It was agreed that Mrs. Welland could not possibly go to Jersey City because she was to accompany her husband to old Catherine's that afternoon, and the Brougham could not be spared. He might have to be taken home at a moment's notice. The Welland sons would of course be downtown. Mr. Lavelle Mingot would be just hurrying back from his shooting, and the Mingot carriage engaged in meeting him, and one could not ask May, at the close of a winter afternoon, to go alone across the ferry to Jersey City, even in her own carriage. Nevertheless, it might appear inhospitable and contrary to old Catherine's express wishes if Madame Olenska were allowed to arrive without any of the family being at the station to receive her. It was just like Ellen, Mrs. Welland's tired voice implied, to place the family in such a dilemma. "It's always one thing after another," the poor lady grieved, in one of her rare revolts against fate. "The only thing that makes me think Mamma must be less well than Dr. Bencomb will admit is this morbid desire to have Ellen come at once. However inconvenient it is to meet her." The words had been thoughtless, as the utterances of impatience often are, and Mr. Welland was upon them with a pounce. "Augusta," he said, turning pale and laying down his fork, "have you any other reason for thinking that Bencomb is less to be relied on than he was? Have you noticed that he has been less conscientious than usual in following up my case or your mother's?" It was Mrs. Welland's turn to grow pale as the endless consequences of her blunder unrolled themselves before her. But she managed to laugh, and take a second helping of scalloped oysters, before she said, struggling back into her old armor of cheerfulness, "My dear, how could you imagine such a thing? I only meant that, after the decided stand Mamma took about its being Ellen's duty to go back to her husband. It seems strange that she should be seized with this sudden whim to see her, when there are half a dozen other grandchildren that she might have asked for. But we must never forget that Mamma, in spite of her wonderful vitality, is a very old woman. Mr. Welling's brow remained clouded, and it was evident that his perturbed imagination had fastened at once on this last remark. Yes, your mother's a very old woman, and for all we know Bencombe may not be as successful with very old people. As you say, my dear, it's always one thing after another, and in another 10 or 15 years I suppose I shall have the pleasing duty of looking about for a new doctor. It's always better to make such a change before it's absolutely necessary. And having arrived at this Spartan decision, Mr. Welland firmly took up his fork. But, all the while, Mrs. Welland began again, as she rose from the luncheon table and led the way into the wilderness of purple satin and malachite known as the back drawing-room. I don't see how Ellen's to be got here tomorrow evening, and I do like to have things settled for at least 24 hours ahead. Archer turned from the fascinated contemplation of a small painting representing two cardinals carousing in an octagonal ebony frame set with medallions of onyx. "Shall I fetch her?" he proposed. "I can easily get away from the office in time to meet the brougham at the ferry. If May will send it there." His heart was beating excitedly as he spoke. Mrs. Welland heaved a sigh of gratitude, and May, who had moved away to the window, turned to shed on him a beam of approval. "So you see, Mamma, everything will be settled 24 hours in advance," she said, stooping over to kiss her mother's troubled forehead. May's brougham awaited her at the door, and she was to drive Archer to Union Square, where he could pick up a Broadway car to carry him to the office. As she settled herself in her corner she said, "I didn't want to worry Mamma by raising fresh obstacles. But how can you meet Ellen tomorrow and bring her back to New York when you are going to Washington?" "Oh, I am not going," Archer answered. "Not going? Why, what's happened?" Her voice was as clear as a bell, and full of wifely solicitude. "The case is off, postponed." "Postponed? How odd! I saw a note this morning from Mr. Letterblair to Mamma saying that he was going to Washington tomorrow for the big patent case that he was to argue before the Supreme Court." "You said it was a patent case, didn't you? Well, that's it. The whole office can't go." Letterblair decided to go this morning. "Then it's not postponed," she continued, with an insistence so unlike her that he felt the blood rising to his face, as if he were blushing for her unwonted lapse from all the traditional delicacies. "No, but my going is," he answered, cursing the unnecessary explanations that he had given when he had announced his intention of going to Washington, and wondering where he had read that clever liars give details, but that the cleverest do not. It did not hurt him half as much to tell May an untruth as to see her trying to pretend that she had not detected him. "I am not going till later on, luckily for the convenience of your family," he continued, taking base refuge in sarcasm. As he spoke he felt that she was looking at him, and he turned his eyes to hers in order not to appear to be avoiding them. Their glances met for a second, and perhaps let them into each other's meanings more deeply than either cared to go. "Yes, it is awfully convenient," May brightly agreed, "that you should be able to meet Ellen after all. You saw how much Mamma appreciated your offering to do it." "Oh, I am delighted to do it." The carriage stopped, and as he jumped out she leaned to him and laid her hand on his. "Good-bye, dearest," she said, her eyes so blue that he wondered afterward if they had shone on him through tears. He turned away and hurried across Union Square, repeating to himself, in a sort of inward chant, "It's all of 2 hours from Jersey City to Old Catherine's. It's all of 2 hours, and it may be more." Roman 29. His wife's dark blue brougham, with the wedding varnish still on it, met Archer at the ferry, and conveyed him luxuriously to the Pennsylvania terminus in Jersey City. It was a somber, snowy afternoon, and the gas lamps were lit in the big reverberating station. As he paced the platform, waiting for the Washington express, he remembered that there were people who thought there would one day be a tunnel under the Hudson through which the trains of the Pennsylvania Railway would run straight into New York. They were of the brotherhood of visionaries who likewise predicted the building of ships that would cross the Atlantic in 5 days. The invention of a flying machine, lighting by electricity, telephonic communication without wires, and other Arabian Night marvels. "I don't care which of their visions comes true," Archer mused, "as long as the tunnel isn't built yet." In his senseless schoolboy happiness, he pictured Madame Olenska's descent from the train, his discovery of her a long way off, among the throngs of meaningless faces, her clinging to his arm as he guided her to the carriage, their slow approach to the wharf among slipping horses, laden carts, vociferating teamsters, and then the startling quiet of the ferry boat, where they would sit side by side under the snow, in the motionless carriage, while the earth seemed to glide away under them, rolling to the other side of the sun. It was incredible, the number of things he had to say to her, and in what eloquent order they were forming themselves on his lips. The clanging and groaning of the train came nearer, and it staggered slowly into the station like a prey-laden monster into its lair. Archer pushed forward, elbowing through the crowd, and staring blindly into window after window of the high-hung carriages. And then, suddenly, he saw Madame Olenska's pale and surprised face close at hand, and had again the mortified sensation of having forgotten what she looked like. They reached each other, their hands met, and he drew her arm through his. "This way, I have the carriage," he said. After that it all happened as he had dreamed. He helped her into the brougham with her bags, and had afterward the vague recollection of having properly reassured her about her grandmother and given her a summary of the Beaufort situation. He was struck by the softness of her, poor Regina. Meanwhile, the carriage had worked its way out of the coil about the station, and they were crawling down the slippery incline to the wharf, menaced by swaying coal carts, bewildered horses, dishevelled express wagons, and an empty hearse. Ah, that hearse! She shut her eyes as it passed, and clutched at Archer's hand. "If only it doesn't mean poor Granny." Oh, no, no, she's much better, she's all right, really, there we've passed it, he exclaimed, as if that made all the difference. Her hand remained in his, and as the carriage lurched across the gangplank onto the ferry he bent over, unbuttoned her tight brown glove, and kissed her palm as if he had kissed a relic. She disengaged herself with a faint smile, and he said, "You didn't expect me today." "Oh, no. I meant to go to Washington to see you. I should made all my arrangements. I very nearly crossed you in the train." "Oh," she exclaimed, as if terrified by the narrowness of their escape. "Do you know, I hardly remembered you. Hardly remembered me. I mean, how shall I explain? It's always so. Each time you happen to me all over again." "Oh, yes, I know, I know. Does it do I too, to you?" he insisted. She nodded, looking out of the window. "Ellen, Ellen, Ellen." She made no answer, and he sat in silence, watching her profile grow indistinct against the snow-streaked dusk beyond the window. What had she been doing in all those 4 long months, he wondered? How little they knew of each other. After all, the precious moments were slipping away, but he had forgotten everything that he had meant to say to her, and could only helplessly brood on the mystery of their remoteness and their proximity, which seemed to be symbolized by the fact of their sitting so close to each other, and yet being unable to see each other's faces. "What a pretty carriage! Is it May's?" she asked, suddenly turning her face from the window. "Yes, it was May who sent you to fetch me, then. How kind of her." He made no answer for a moment. Then he said explosively, "Your husband's secretary came to see me the day after we met in Boston." In his brief letter to her he had made no allusion to M. Riviere's visit, and his intention had been to bury the incident in his bosom. But her reminder that they were in his wife's carriage provoked him to an impulse of retaliation. He would see if she liked his reference to Riviere any better than he liked hers to May, as on certain other occasions when he had expected to shake her out of her usual composure. She betrayed no sign of surprise, and at once he concluded, "He writes to her, then." M. Riviere went to see you. Yes, didn't you know? No, she answered simply. And you are not surprised? She hesitated. Why should I be? He told me in Boston that he knew you. That he should met you in England, I think. Ellen, I must ask you one thing. Yes, I wanted to ask it after I saw him, but I couldn't put it in a letter. It was Riviere who helped you to get away when you left your husband. His heart was beating suffocatingly. Would she meet this question with the same composure? Yes, I owe him a great debt, she answered, without the least tremor in her quiet voice. Her tone was so natural, so almost indifferent, that Archer's turmoil subsided. Once more she had managed, by her sheer simplicity, to make him feel stupidly conventional just when he thought he was flinging convention to the winds. "I think you are the most honest woman I ever met," he exclaimed. "Oh, no, but probably one of the least fussy," she answered, a smile in her voice. "Call it what you like. You look at things as they are." Ah, I've had to look at the Gorgon. Well, it hasn't blinded you. You've seen that she's just an old bogey like all the others. She doesn't blind one, but she dries up one's tears. The answer checked the pleading on Archer's lips. It seemed to come from depths of experience beyond his reach. A slow advance of the ferry boat had ceased, and her bows bumped against the piles of the slip with a violence that made the brougham stagger, and flung Archer and Madame Olenska against each other. The young man, trembling, felt the pressure of her shoulder and passed his arm about her. If you are not blind, then you must see that this can't last. What can't? Our being together and not together. No. You ought not to have come today, she said in an altered voice, and suddenly she turned, flung her arms about him and pressed her lips to his. At the same moment the carriage began to move, and a gas lamp at the head of the slip flashed its light into the window. She drew away, and they sat silent and motionless while the brougham struggled through the congestion of carriages about the ferry landing. As they gained the street, Archer began to speak hurriedly. Don't be afraid of me. You needn't squeeze yourself back into your corner like that. A stolen kiss isn't what I want. Look, I am not even trying to touch the sleeve of your jacket. Don't suppose that I don't understand your reasons for not wanting to let this feeling between us dwindle into an ordinary hole and corner love affair. I couldn't have spoken like this yesterday, because when we've been apart, and I am looking forward to seeing you. Every thought is burnt up in a great flame, but then you come, and you are so much more than I remembered. And what I want of you is so much more than an hour or two every now and then, with wastes of thirsty waiting between. That I can sit perfectly still beside you, like this, with that other vision in my mind, just quietly trusting to it to come true. For a moment she made no reply, then she asked, hardly above a whisper, "What do you mean by trusting to it to come true?" "Why, you know it will, don't you? Your vision of you and me together." She burst into a sudden hard laugh. "You choose your place well to put it to me. Do you mean because we are in my wife's brougham? Shall we get out and walk? Then, I don't suppose you mind a little snow." She laughed again, more gently. "No, I shan't get out and walk, because my business is to get to Granny's as quickly as I can. And you will sit beside me, and we will look, not at visions, but at realities." "I don't know what you mean by realities. The only reality to me is this." She met the words with a long silence, during which the carriage rolled down an obscure side street, and then turned into the searching illumination of Fifth Avenue. "Is it your idea, then, that I should live with you as your mistress since I can't be your wife?" she asked. The crudeness of the question startled him. The word was one that women of his class fought shy of, even when their talk flitted closest about the topic. He noticed that Madame Olenska pronounced it as if it had a recognized place in her vocabulary, and he wondered if it had been used familiarly in her presence in the horrible life she had fled from. Her question pulled him up with a jerk, and he floundered. I want somehow to get away with you into a world where words like that categories like that won't exist, where we shall be simply two human beings who love each other, who are the whole of life to each other, and nothing else on earth will matter." She drew a deep sigh that ended in another laugh. "Oh, my dear, where is that country? Have you ever been there?" she asked, and as he remained sullenly dumb she went on, "I know so many wo've tried to find it, and, believe me, they all got out by mistake at wayside stations, at places like Boulogne, or Pisa, or Monte Carlo, and it wasn't at all different from the old world they should left, but only rather smaller and dingier and more promiscuous." He had never heard her speak in such a tone, and he remembered the phrase she had used a little while before. "Yes, the Gorgon has dried your tears," he said. "Well, she opened my eyes too. It's a delusion to say that she blinds people. What she does is just the contrary. She fastens their eyelids open, so that they are never again in the blessed darkness. Isn't there a Chinese torture like that? There ought to be. Ah, believe me, it's a miserable little country." The carriage had crossed 42nd Street. May's sturdy Brougham horse was carrying them northward as if he had been a Kentucky trotter. Archer choked with the sense of wasted minutes and vain words. "Then, what, exactly, is your plan for us?" he asked. "For U.S. But there's no U.S. in that sense. We are near each other only if we stay far from each other. Then we can be ourselves. Otherwise we are only Newland Archer, the husband of Ellen Olenska's cousin, and Ellen Olenska, the cousin of Newland Archer's wife, trying to be happy behind the backs of the people who trust them." "Ah, I am beyond that," he groaned. "No, you are not. You've never been beyond." "And I have," she said in a strange voice, "and I know what it looks like there." He sat silent, dazed with inarticulate pain. Then he groped in the darkness of the carriage for the little bell that signaled orders to the coachman. He remembered that May rang twice when she wished to stop. He pressed the bell, and the carriage drew up beside the curbstone. "Why are we stopping? This is not Granny's," Madame Olenska exclaimed. "No, I shall get out here," he stammered, opening the door and jumping to the pavement. By the light of a street lamp he saw her startled face, and the instinctive motion she made to detain him. He closed the door and leaned for a moment in the window. "You are right. I ought not to have come today," he said, lowering his voice so that the coachman should not hear. She bent forward and seemed about to speak, but he had already called out the order to drive on, and the carriage rolled away while he stood on the corner. The snow was over, and a tingling wind had sprung up, that lashed his face as he stood gazing. Suddenly he felt something stiff and cold on his lashes, and perceived that he had been crying, and that the wind had frozen his tears. He thrust his hands in his pockets, and walked at a sharp pace down Fifth Avenue to his own house. XXX. That evening when Archer came down before dinner, he found the drawing-room empty. He and May were dining alone, all the family engagements having been postponed since Mrs. Manson Mingot's illness. And as May was the more punctual of the two, he was surprised that she had not preceded him. He knew that she was at home, for while he dressed, he had heard her moving about in her room, and he wondered what had delayed her. He had fallen into the way of dwelling on such conjectures as a means of tying his thoughts fast to reality. Sometimes he felt as if he had found the clue to his father-in-law's absorption in trifles. Perhaps even Mr. Welland, long ago, had had escapes and visions, and had conjured up all the hosts of domesticity to defend himself against them. When May appeared, he thought she looked tired. She had put on the low-necked and tightly laced dinner dress which the Mingot ceremonial exacted on the most informal occasions, and had built her fair hair into its usual accumulated coils, and her face, in contrast, was wan and almost faded. But she shone on him with her usual tenderness, and her eyes had kept the blue dazzle of the day before. "What became of you, dear?" she asked. "I was waiting at Granny's, and Ellen came alone, and said she had dropped you on the way because you had to rush off on business." "There's nothing wrong. Only some letters I should forgotten, and wanted to get off before dinner." "Ah," she said, and a moment afterward, "I am sorry you didn't come to Granny's unless the letters were urgent." "They were," he rejoined, surprised at her insistence. "Besides, I don't see why I should have gone to your grandmother's." "I didn't know you were there." She turned and moved to the looking-glass above the mantel-piece. As she stood there, lifting her long arm to fasten a puff that had slipped from its place in her intricate hair, Archer was struck by something languid and inelastic in her attitude, and wondered if the deadly monotony of their lives had laid its weight on her also. Then he remembered that, as he had left the house that morning, she had called over the stairs that she would meet him at her grandmother's, so that they might drive home together. He had called back a cheery yes, and then, absorbed in other visions, had forgotten his promise. Now he was smitten with compunction, yet irritated that so trifling an omission should be stored up against him after nearly 2 years of marriage. He was weary of living in a perpetual tepid honeymoon, without the temperature of passion, yet with all its exactions. If May had spoken out her grievances, he suspected her of many, he might have laughed them away. But she was trained to conceal imaginary wounds under a Spartan smile. To disguise his own annoyance, he asked how her grandmother was, and she answered that Mrs. Mingot was still improving, but had been rather disturbed by the last news about the Beauforts. "What news?" "It seems they are going to stay in New York. I believe he's going into an insurance business or something. They are looking about for a small house." The preposterousness of the case was beyond discussion, and they went into dinner. During dinner their talk moved in its usual limited circle, but Archer noticed that his wife made no allusion to Madame Olenska, nor to old Catherine's reception of her. He was thankful for the fact, yet felt it to be vaguely ominous. They went up to the library for coffee, and Archer lit a cigar and took down a volume of Michelet. He had taken to history in the evenings since May had shown a tendency to ask him to read aloud whenever she saw him with a volume of poetry. Not that he disliked the sound of his own voice, but because he could always foresee her comments on what he read. In the days of their engagement she had simply, as he now perceived, echoed what he told her. But since he had ceased to provide her with opinions, she had begun to hazard her own, with results destructive to his enjoyment of the works commented on. Seeing that he had chosen history, she fetched her work-basket, drew up an arm-chair to the green-shaded student lamp, and uncovered a cushion she was embroidering for his sofa. She was not a clever needle-woman. Her large, capable hands were made for riding, rowing, and open-air activities. But since other wives embroidered cushions for their husbands, she did not wish to omit this last link in her devotion. She was so placed that Archer, by merely raising his eyes, could see her bent above her work frame, her ruffled elbow sleeves slipping back from her firm round arms, the betrothal sapphire shining on her left hand above her broad gold wedding ring, and the right hand slowly and laboriously stabbing the canvas. As she sat thus, the lamplight full on her clear brow, he said to himself with a secret dismay that he would always know the thoughts behind it, that never, in all the years to come, would she surprise him by an unexpected mood, by a new idea, a weakness, a cruelty, or an emotion. She had spent her poetry and romance on their short courting. The function was exhausted because the need was past. Now she was simply ripening into a copy of her mother, and mysteriously, by the very process, trying to turn him into a Mr. Welland. He laid down his book and stood up impatiently, and at once she raised her head. "What's the matter? The room is stifling. I want a little air." He had insisted that the library curtains should draw backward and forward on a rod, so that they might be closed in the evening, instead of remaining nailed to a gilt cornice and immovably looped up over layers of lace, as in the drawing-room. And he pulled them back and pushed up the sash, leaning out into the icy night. The mere fact of not looking at May, seated beside his table, under his lamp, the fact of seeing other houses, roofs, chimneys, of getting the sense of other lives outside his own, other cities beyond New York, and a whole world beyond his world, cleared his brain and made it easier to breathe. After he had leaned out into the darkness for a few minutes he heard her say, "Newland, do shut the window. You will catch your death." He pulled the sash down and turned back. "Catch my death," he echoed, and he felt like adding, "but I've caught it already. I am dead. I've been dead for months and months." And suddenly the play of the word flashed up, a wild suggestion. What if it were she who was dead, if she were going to die soon and leave him free? The sensation of standing there, in that warm, familiar room, and looking at her, and wishing her dead, was so strange, so fascinating and overmastering, that its enormity did not immediately strike him. He simply felt that chance had given him a new possibility to which his sick soul might cling. Yes, May might die. People did. Young people, healthy people like herself. She might die, and set him suddenly free. She glanced up, and he saw by her widening eyes that there must be something strange in his own. "Newland, are you ill?" He shook his head and turned toward his arm-chair. She bent over her work frame, and as he passed he laid his hand on her hair. "Poor May," he said. "Poor, why poor?" she echoed with a strained laugh. "Because I shall never be able to open a window without worrying you," he rejoined, laughing also. For a moment she was silent, then she said very low, her head bowed over her work, "I shall never worry if you are happy." "Ah, my dear, and I shall never be happy unless I can open the windows." "In this weather," she remonstrated, and with a sigh he buried his head in his book. 6 or 7 days passed. Archer heard nothing from Madame Olenska, and became aware that her name would not be mentioned in his presence by any member of the family. He did not try to see her. To do so while she was at old Catherine's guarded bedside would have been almost impossible. In the uncertainty of the situation, he let himself drift, conscious, somewhere below the surface of his thoughts, of a resolve which had come to him when he had leaned out from his library window into the icy night. The strength of that resolve made it easy to wait and make no sign. Then one day May told him that Mrs. Manson Mingot had asked to see him. There was nothing surprising in the request, for the old lady was steadily recovering, and she had always openly declared that she preferred Archer to any of her other grandsons-in-law. May gave the message with evident pleasure. She was proud of old Catherine's appreciation of her husband. There was a moment's pause, and then Archer felt it incumbent on him to say, "All right. Shall we go together this afternoon?" His wife's face brightened, but she instantly answered, "Oh, you should much better go alone. It bores Granny to see the same people too often." Archer's heart was beating violently when he rang old Mrs. Mingot's bell. He had wanted above all things to go alone, for he felt sure the visit would give him the chance of saying a word in private to the Countess Olenska. He had determined to wait till the chance presented itself naturally, and here it was, and here he was on the doorstep. Behind the door, behind the curtains of the yellow damask room next to the hall, she was surely awaiting him. In another moment he should see her, and be able to speak to her before she led him to the sick room. He wanted only to put one question. After that his course would be clear. What he wished to ask was simply the date of her return to Washington, and that question she could hardly refuse to answer. But in the yellow sitting-room it was the mulatto maid who waited. Her white teeth shining like a keyboard, she pushed back the sliding doors and ushered him into old Catherine's presence. The old woman sat in a vast throne-like armchair near her bed. Beside her was a mahogany stand bearing a cast bronze lamp with an engraved globe, over which a green paper shade had been balanced. There was not a book or a newspaper in reach, nor any evidence of feminine employment. Conversation had always been Mrs. Mingot's sole pursuit, and she would have scorned to feign an interest in fancy work. Archer saw no trace of the slight distortion left by her stroke. She merely looked paler, with darker shadows in the folds and recesses of her obesity, and in the fluted mop-cap tied by a starched bow between her first two chins, and the muslin kerchief crossed over her billowing purple dressing-gown. She seemed like some shrewd and kindly ancestress of her own who might have yielded too freely to the pleasures of the table. She held out one of the little hands that nestled in a hollow of her huge lap like pet animals, and called to the maid, "Don't let in anyone else. If my daughters call, say I am asleep." The maid disappeared, and the old lady turned to her grandson. "My dear, am I perfectly hideous?" she asked gaily, launching out one hand in search of the folds of muslin on her inaccessible bosom. "My daughters tell me it doesn't matter at my age, as if hideousness didn't matter, all the more the harder it gets to conceal." "My dear, you are handsomer than ever," Archer rejoined in the same tone, and she threw back her head and laughed. "Ah, but not as handsome as Ellen," she jerked out, twinkling at him maliciously, and before he could answer she added, "Was she so awfully handsome the day you drove her up from the ferry?" He laughed, and she continued, "Was it because you told her so that she had to put you out on the way? In my youth young men didn't desert pretty women unless they were made to." She gave another chuckle, and interrupted it to say almost querulously, "It's a pity she didn't marry you. I always told her so. It would have spared me all this worry." But who ever thought of sparing their grandmother worry? Archer wondered if her illness had blurred her faculties, but suddenly she broke out, "Well, it's settled. Anyhow, she's going to stay with me. Whatever the rest of the family say, she hadn't been here 5 minutes before I should have gone down on my knees to keep her, if only for the last 20 years I should been able to see where the floor was." Archer listened in silence, and she went on, "They should talk me over, as no doubt you know, persuaded me. Lavelle, and Letterblair, and Augusta Welland, and all the rest of them, that I must hold out and cut off her allowance, till she was made to see that it was her duty to go back to Olenska. They thought they should convince me when the secretary, or whatever he was, came out with the last proposals. Handsome proposals, I confess they were. After all, marriage is marriage, and money's money, both useful things in their way. And I didn't know what to answer." She broke off and drew a long breath, as if speaking had become an effort. "But the minute I laid eyes on her, I said, 'You sweet bird, you, shut you up in that cage again, never!' And now it's settled that she's to stay here and nurse her granny as long as there's a granny to nurse. It's not a gay prospect, but she doesn't mind, and of course I've told Letterblair that she's to be given her proper allowance." The young man heard her with veins aglow, but in his confusion of mind he hardly knew whether her news brought joy or pain. He had so definitely decided on the course he meant to pursue that for the moment he could not readjust his thoughts. But gradually there stole over him the delicious sense of difficulties deferred and opportunities miraculously provided. If Ellen had consented to come and live with her grandmother, it must surely be because she had recognized the impossibility of giving him up. This was her answer to his final appeal of the other day, if she would not take the extreme step he had urged. She had at last yielded to half measures. He sank back into the thought with the involuntary relief of a man who has been ready to risk everything, and suddenly tastes the dangerous sweetness of security. She couldn't have gone back, it was impossible, he exclaimed. "Ah, my dear, I always knew you were on her side, and that's why I sent for you today, and why I said to your pretty wife, when she proposed to come with you, 'No, my dear, I am pining to see Newland, and I don't want anybody to share our transports.' For you see, my dear," she drew her head back as far as its tethering chins permitted, and looked him full in the eyes, "you see, we shall have a fight yet. The family don't want her here, and they will say it's because I've been ill, because I am a weak old woman. That's just persuaded me. I am not well enough yet to fight them one by one, and you've got to do it for me." He stammered. "You, why not?" She jerked back at him, her round eyes suddenly as sharp as pen-knives. Her hand fluttered from its chair arm and lit on his with a clutch of little pale nails like bird claws. "Why not?" she searchingly repeated. Archer, under the exposure of her gaze, had recovered his self-possession. "Oh, I don't count. I am too insignificant." "Well, you are Letterblair's partner, ain't you? You've got to get at them through Letterblair." "Unless you've got a reason," she insisted. "Oh, my dear, I back you to hold your own against them all without my help." "But you shall have it if you need it," he reassured her. "Then we are safe," she sighed, and smiling on him with all her ancient cunning, she added, as she settled her head among the cushions, "I always knew you should back us up." "Because they never quote you when they talk about its being her duty to go home?" He winced a little at her terrifying perspicacity, and longed to ask, "And may do they quote her?" but he judged it safer to turn the question. "And Madame Olenska, when am I to see her?" he said. The old lady chuckled, crumpled her lids, and went through the pantomime of archness. "Not today, one at a time, please. Madame Olenska's gone out." He flushed with disappointment, and she went on, "She's gone out, my child, gone in my carriage to see Regina Beaufort." She paused for this announcement to produce its effect. "That's what she's reduced me to already. The day after she got here, she put on her best bonnet and told me, as cool as a cucumber, that she was going to call on Regina Beaufort. 'I don't know her. Who is she?' says I. 'She's your grand-niece, and a most unhappy woman,' she says. 'She's the wife of a scoundrel,' I answered. 'Well,' she says, 'and so am I, and yet all my family want me to go back to him.' Well, that floored me, and I let her go, and finally one day she said it was raining too hard to go out on foot, and she wanted me to lend her my carriage. 'What for?' I asked her, and she said, 'To go and see Cousin Regina.' Cousin, now, my dear, I looked out of the window, and saw it wasn't raining a drop. After all, Regina's a brave woman, and so is she, and I've always liked courage above everything." Archer bent down and pressed his lips on the little hand that still lay on his. Whose hand did you think you were kissing? Young man, your wife's, I hope," the old lady snapped out with her mocking cackle. And as he rose to go she called out after him, "Give her her granny's love, but you should better not say anything about our talk." Roman 31. Archer had been stunned by old Catherine's news. It was only natural that Madame Olenska should have hastened from Washington in response to her grandmother's summons, but that she should have decided to remain under her roof, especially now that Mrs. Mingot had almost regained her health, was less easy to explain. Archer was sure that Madame Olenska's decision had not been influenced by the change in her financial situation. He knew the exact figure of the small income which her husband had allowed her at their separation. Without the addition of her grandmother's allowance, it was hardly enough to live on in any sense known to the Mingot vocabulary. And now that Medora Manson, who shared her life, had been ruined, such a pittance would barely keep the two women clothed and fed. Yet Archer was convinced that Madame Olenska had not accepted her grandmother's offer from interested motives. She had the heedless generosity and the spasmodic extravagance of persons used to large fortunes and indifferent to money. But she could go without many things which her relations considered indispensable, and Mrs. Lovell Mingot and Mrs. Welland had often been heard to deplore that anyone who had enjoyed the cosmopolitan luxuries of Count Olenski's establishments should care so little about how things were done. Moreover, as Archer knew, several months had passed since her allowance had been cut off. Yet in the interval she had made no effort to regain her grandmother's favor. Therefore, if she had changed her course, it must be for a different reason. He did not have far to seek for that reason. On the way from the ferry she had told him that he and she must remain apart. But she had said it with her head on his breast. He knew that there was no calculated coquetry in her words. She was fighting her fate as he had fought his, and clinging desperately to her resolve that they should not break faith with the people who trusted them. But during the 10 days which had elapsed since her return to New York, she had perhaps guessed from his silence, and from the fact of his making no attempt to see her, that he was meditating a decisive step, a step from which there was no turning back. At the thought, a sudden fear of her own weakness might have seized her, and she might have felt that, after all, it was better to accept the compromise usual in such cases, and follow the line of least resistance. An hour earlier, when he had rung Mrs. Mingot's bell, Archer had fancied that his path was clear before him. He had meant to have a word alone with Madame Olenska, and failing that, to learn from her grandmother on what day, and by which train, she was returning to Washington. In that train, he intended to join her, and travel with her to Washington, or as much farther as she was willing to go. His own fancy inclined to Japan. At any rate, she would understand at once that, wherever she went, he was going. He meant to leave a note for May that should cut off any other alternative. He had fancied himself not only nerved for this plunge but eager to take it, yet his first feeling on hearing that the course of events was changed had been one of relief. Now, however, as he walked home from Mrs. Mingot's, he was conscious of a growing distaste for what lay before him. There was nothing unknown or unfamiliar in the path he was presumably to tread, but when he had trodden it before, it was as a free man, who was accountable to no one for his actions, and could lend himself with an amused detachment to the game of precautions and prevarications, concealments and compliances, that the part required. This procedure was called protecting a woman's honor, and the best fiction, combined with the after-dinner talk of his elders, had long since initiated him into every detail of its code. Now he saw the matter in a new light, and his part in it seemed singularly diminished. It was, in fact, that which, with a secret fatuity, he had watched Mrs. Thorley Rushworth play toward a fond and unperceiving husband, a smiling, bantering, humoring, watchful and incessant lie, a lie by day, a lie by night, a lie in every touch and every look, a lie in every caress and every quarrel, a lie in every word, and in every silence. It was easier, and less dastardly on the whole, for a wife to play such a part toward her husband. A woman's standard of truthfulness was tacitly held to be lower. She was the subject creature, and versed in the arts of the enslaved. Then she could always plead moods and nerves, and the right not to be held too strictly to account. And even in the most straight-laced societies the laugh was always against the husband. But in Archer's little world no one laughed at a wife deceived, and a certain measure of contempt was attached to men who continued their philandering after marriage. In the rotation of crops there was a recognized season for wild oats, but they were not to be sown more than once. Archer had always shared this view. In his heart he thought Lefferts despicable. But to love Ellen Olenska was not to become a man like Lefferts. For the first time Archer found himself face to face with the dread argument of the individual case. Ellen Olenska was like no other woman, he was like no other man, their situation, therefore, resembled no one else's. And they were answerable to no tribunal, but that of their own judgment. Yes, but in 10 minutes more he would be mounting his own doorstep, and there were May and habit and honor, and all the old decencies that he and his people had always believed in. At his corner he hesitated, and then walked on down Fifth Avenue. Ahead of him, in the winter night, loomed a big unlit house. As he drew near, he thought how often he had seen it blazing with lights, its steps awninged and carpeted, and carriages waiting in double line to draw up at the curbstone. It was in the conservatory that stretched its dead black bulk down the side street that he had taken his first kiss from May. It was under the myriad candles of the ballroom that he had seen her appear, tall and silver shining as a young Diana. Now the house was as dark as the grave, except for a faint flare of gas in the basement, and a light in one upstairs room where the blind had not been lowered. As Archer reached the corner, he saw that the carriage standing at the door was Mrs. Manson Mingott's. What an opportunity for Sillerton Jackson, if he should chance to pass! Archer had been greatly moved by old Catherine's account of Madame Olenska's attitude toward Mrs. Beaufort. It made the righteous reprobation of New York seem like a passing by on the other side. But he knew well enough what construction the clubs and drawing-rooms would put on Ellen Olenska's visits to her cousin. He paused and looked up at the lighted window. No doubt the two women were sitting together in that room. Beaufort had probably sought consolation elsewhere. There were even rumors that he had left New York with Fanny Ring, but Mrs. Beaufort's attitude made the report seem improbable. Archer had the nocturnal perspective of Fifth Avenue almost to himself. At that hour most people were indoors, dressing for dinner, and he was secretly glad that Ellen's exit was likely to be unobserved. As the thought passed through his mind, the door opened, and she came out. Behind her was a faint light, such as might have been carried down the stairs to show her the way. She turned to say a word to someone, then the door closed, and she came down the steps. "Ellen," he said in a low voice, as she reached the pavement. She stopped with a slight start, and just then he saw two young men of fashionable cut approaching. There was a familiar air about their overcoats, and the way their smart silk mufflers were folded over their white ties. And he wondered how youths of their quality happened to be dining out so early. Then he remembered that the Reggie Chiverses, whose house was a few doors above, were taking a large party that evening to see Adelaide Neilson in Romeo and Juliet, and guessed that the two were of the number. They passed under a lamp, and he recognized Lawrence Lefferts and a young Chivers. A mean desire not to have Madame Olenska seen at the Beaufort's door vanished as he felt the penetrating warmth of her hand. "I shall see you now we shall be together," he broke out, hardly knowing what he said. "Ah," she answered, "Granny has told you." While he watched her he was aware that Lefferts and Chivers, on reaching the farther side of the street corner, had discreetly struck away across Fifth Avenue. It was the kind of masculine solidarity that he himself often practiced. Now he sickened at their connivance. Did she really imagine that he and she could live like this? And if not, what else did she imagine? "Tomorrow I must see you somewhere where we can be alone," he said, in a voice that sounded almost angry to his own ears. She wavered, and moved toward the carriage. "But I shall be at Granny's for the present, that is," she added, as if conscious that her change of plans required some explanation. "Somewhere where we can be alone," he insisted. She gave a faint laugh that grated on him. "In New York, but there are no churches, no monuments." "There's the art museum in the park," he explained, as she looked puzzled. "At 2:30. I shall be at the door." She turned away without answering and got quickly into the carriage. As it drove off she leaned forward, and he thought she waved her hand in the obscurity. He stared after her in a turmoil of contradictory feelings. It seemed to him that he had been speaking not to the woman he loved but to another, a woman he was indebted to for pleasures already wearied of. It was hateful to find himself the prisoner of this hackneyed vocabulary. "She will come," he said to himself, almost contemptuously. Avoiding the popular Wolfe collection, whose anecdotic canvases filled one of the main galleries of the queer wilderness of cast iron and encaustic tiles known as the Metropolitan Museum, they had wandered down a passage to the room where the Cessnola antiquities mouldered in unvisited loneliness. They had this melancholy retreat to themselves, and seated on the divan enclosing the central steam radiator, they were staring silently at the glass cabinets mounted in ebonized wood which contained the recovered fragments of Ilium. "It's odd," Madame Olenska said. "I never came here before." "Ah, well, Some day, I suppose, it will be a great museum." "Yes," she assented absently. She stood up and wandered across the room. Archer, remaining seated, watched the light movements of her figure, so girlish even under its heavy furs. A cleverly planted heron wing in her fur cap. His mind, as always when they first met, was wholly absorbed in the delicious details that made her herself and no other. Presently he rose and approached the case before which she stood. Its glass shelves were crowded with small broken objects, hardly recognizable domestic utensils, ornaments and personal trifles made of glass, of clay, of discolored bronze and other time-blurred substances. "It seems cruel," he said, "that after a while nothing matters, any more than these little things that used to be necessary and important to forgotten people, and now have to be guessed at under a magnifying glass and labeled use unknown." Yes, but meanwhile, meanwhile, as she stood there, in her long sealskin coat, her veil drawn down like a transparent mask to the tip of her nose, and the bunch of violets he had brought her stirring with her quickly taken breath, it seemed incredible that this pure harmony of line and color should ever suffer the stupid law of change. "Meanwhile, everything matters that concerns you," he said. She looked at him thoughtfully, and turned back to the divan. He sat down beside her and waited, but suddenly he heard a step echoing far off down the empty rooms, and felt the pressure of the minutes. "What is it you wanted to tell me?" she asked, as if she had received the same warning. "What I wanted to tell you," he rejoined, "why, that I believe you came to New York because you were afraid." "Afraid of my coming to Washington?" She looked down at her muff, and he saw her hands stir in it uneasily. "Well, well, yes," she said. "You were afraid, you knew?" "Yes, I knew." "Well, then," he insisted, "well, then, this is better, isn't it?" She returned with a long questioning sigh. "Better. We shall hurt others less, isn't it, after all, what you always wanted?" "To have you here, you mean, in reach and yet out of reach, to meet you in this way on the sly. It's the very reverse of what I want." "I told you the other day what I wanted." She hesitated. "And you still think this worse?" "1,000 times." He paused. "It would be easy to lie to you, but the truth is I think it detestable." "Oh, so do I," she cried with a deep breath of relief. He sprang up impatiently. "Well, then it's my turn to ask, what is it, in God's name, that you think better?" She hung her head and continued to clasp and unclasp her hands in her muff. The step drew nearer, and a guardian in a braided cap walked listlessly through the room like a ghost stalking through a necropolis. They fixed their eyes simultaneously on the case opposite them, and when the official figure had vanished down a vista of mummies and sarcophagi, Archer spoke again. "What do you think better?" Instead of answering, she murmured, "I promised Granny to stay with her because it seemed to me that here I should be safer." "From me?" She bent her head slightly, without looking at him. "Safer from loving me." Her profile did not stir, but he saw a tear overflow on her lashes and hang in a mesh of her veil. Safer from doing irreparable harm. Don't let us be like all the others, she protested. What others? I don't profess to be different from my kind. I am consumed by the same wants and the same longings. She glanced at him with a kind of terror, and he saw a faint color steal into her cheeks. Shall I once come to you, and then go home? She suddenly hazarded in a low, clear voice. The blood rushed to the young man's forehead. Dearest, he said, without moving. It seemed as if he held his heart in his hands, like a full cup that the least motion might overbrim. Then her last phrase struck his ear and his face clouded. Go home, what do you mean by going home? Thanks to StreamBooks.